Hi everyone, this is Ricky Spencer as part of the Sociology of Media Voices series. Today I have someone whom I have quoted in some of my essays when I was doing my Masters of Education at the Uni of Melbourne. She is a woman of vision. I believe she is a future leader that we will try and push her to perhaps one day into politics because her ideas are really influential, and I hope they are shaping the way we look at gender, 21st century. I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Dr. Hannah McCann. Is that right? Did I get it right? Yes, Dr. Hannah McCann. Her pronouns are she and her. She is a senior lecturer in cultural studies and a DECRA Fellow at the University of Melbourne. Her research in critical femininity studies explores feminist disclosure on femininity, queer, femme, LGBTQ plus communities, beauty, culture, and queer fangirls. Her book, Queering Femininity, Sexuality, Feminism, and the Politics of Presentation, was published with Routledge in 2018. And a co-authored textbook, Queer Theory Now from Foundations to Futures, with Red Global Press in 2020. Great text, I have to say, everyone. Get a copy. Her current DECRA project examines the relationship between salon workers and their clients and the implications of accounting for labour and identity in the salon space of thinking about beauty more broadly. Wow. Where do I start? But let's welcome the lovely Dr. Hannah McCann. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So tell us your story. Where did this passion begin?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I was doing my undergrad, I ended up actually in philosophy, and I did my honors in philosophy, looking at Judith Butler and Simone de Beauvoir. So I was very interested in gender, even though I wasn't in gender studies at the time. And then I went to work in the public service in Canberra for a few years, and I worked in like the Office for Children and Young People and kind of around a lot of social workers and that kind of space. But I missed university. So I ended up applying for a special scholarship that came up through the ANU Gender Institute, which is a really fantastic institute. If people haven't heard of it, you can sign up to their newsletter and get details about their events and things like that. And they had this one-off kind of PhD scholarship that wasn't attached to any discipline. And I applied for it and got it, which was really amazing. And I ended up kind of sitting between sociology and cultural studies at the ANU. So in this gender studies space, very interdisciplinary. And I basically, my PhD was on queer femininity, which ended up being the book that I wrote in 2018. And it involved interviewing people who identify as queer femme. So for people that don't know, queer femme is kind of a subculture within the LGBTQ community. And it's really about people who somehow align themselves with feminine presentation or a kind of femme presentation identity, and identify as queer. And when I was recruiting for interviewees for my PhD, I just said, whoever identifies as queer femme. I didn't have a definition. You didn't have to look a particular way. It was just, if that identity resonated with you, I wanted to talk to those people. And so, yeah, the PhD ended up being about those people's experiences, but also about feminist discourse and how it's kind of, how feminist theory and thought has kind of talked about femininity, theorized femininity, and how that has been hard for queer femmes, I guess, who identify as feminist, and, the kind of feeling of marginalization of femininity within feminism, but also within queer theory, a kind of gap in like thinking about femininity as well, and this kind of space between, in theory terms, but then in like practical, real lived experience terms, queer femmes not feeling like they fit into the straight world, their queerness being obscured by their sometimes normative feminine presentation, but then in queer spaces feeling like they were read as straight people. So yeah, I mean, that's really what the PhD was about. I'm starting early here.
Wow, that's so fascinating. It's an area for myself that I've explored for many years, and I wonder whether within your PhD, what was the age of your participants? I mean, did you have any people, say, over 50 who participated? And were their experiences of their presentation different to, say, someone in their early 20s?
Yeah, so I did have a couple of femmes who are in the kind of older age category. And, I think there was a lot of similar experiences actually in terms of that feeling like you're in an in-between space, or that there's a lot of assumptions that are made about you because of your gender appearance or because of the kind of gender things that you want to engage with, right? But at the same time, the big difference is the eras that people have lived through, because queer femme isn't a new kind of subcultural identity. It's something that's kind of gone through waves and has been more prominent at different times. And so, people have lived through different like iterations of that, recognition of that, different feminist eras as well, in terms of like how femininity is being thought of. The 90s was a very different time for kind of like trying to reclaim some feminine presentation more than the kind of earlier period of really rejecting it in many ways. So the older femmes had a different experience and had also, I suppose, maybe settled into themselves more than some of the younger femmes that I spoke to, who were kind of struggling with it a lot. So yeah, I mean, it feels like ancient history now to think back on that. But one of the really interesting things I did during that period was I went to Berlin for a femme conference. There was a few kind of community-led conferences around femme identity that happened in spaces like Berlin. And it was really great to go and kind of get a different feeling for like what people in Europe were talking about femme. It was pretty similar. But yeah, like also, I guess one of the things that I ended up kind of concluding with the PhD was that ironically, this thing emerges within queer femme spaces where it's almost like new norms of how to present yourself in queer femme ways emerge. So like femininity, but a bit different as a way to signal queerness, but in a way that reinforces paradoxically these rules of presentation and this idea that we can't just see anyone as queer, that everyone around us is, we don't know their gender, we don't know their sexuality just because of how they're presenting themselves. And yet, because in those spaces you end up getting these kind of like subcultural norms that occur, it kind of limits like how queerly we can see femininity. So that's really what I was arguing in the end, was like we should be able to see all femininity as queer.
Wow, that's extremely fascinating. And did you touch on, or any part of your, I guess the later part of your research, how digital spaces have perhaps morphed or allowed for a more powerful way of presenting the self? And I'm thinking of TikTok, I guess that probably wasn't around then, but even Instagram and Facebook. Do you think those sort of platforms give rise to a greater visibility of the femme presentation?
Well, interestingly, and this is showing my age, when I was doing this PhD, it was Tumblr that was the big thing. And there was a lot of femme, like a lot of articulation of femme, but also like a huge diversity of gender presentations and identifications and sexualities that came through Tumblr, which a lot of people have done great work on. I did end up doing some collaborative work with Gemma Killen, who just finished her PhD at the ANU recently. And her PhD was focused on Autostraddle, the website for queer women, and you know, how that space kind of produced communities for femmes and other people of other presentations. So we did some work together, but very similar kind of conclusions, I guess, about like the limits of articulating queerness, I suppose, and like when you create spaces of belonging, they kind of rely on an exclusion of some kind. So how that can end up being quite problematic in terms of thinking about definitions of gender and sexuality. So yeah, I definitely encourage people to look up Gemma Killen's work if they're interested. She's done some really good stuff on how those online spaces are also like archiving queer lives, which is really interesting. And there's not that much attention to that, I don't think. Like, so much queer articulation happens online now, but who's saving that? You know, who's making sure we record that history, our history? Yeah, and it's all very ephemeral. So something to kind of think about more.
And I'm now going to pose a question that sort of came to me. Is this phenomenon based purely in Western cultures, or is this universally a way forward, a movement that's bridging cultures across the world?
I think femme is a very Western kind of term, and I think that since I was working on queer femme identity, there's been a lot of different terms and things that have emerged since then. Like, for example, when I was doing my PhD, non-binary wasn't really something that anyone talked about. You know, genderqueer was a term that people used, but not non-binary. That wasn't until a few years later. And I think that probably heaps of the femmes I interviewed, if I interviewed them now, they might actually say, actually, I'm more aligned with kind of feminine non-binary presentation than I am femme, you know? So even in the West, like these terms are constantly changing and the articulations are constantly changing. I think that my research was, aside from that trip to Berlin, totally focused on Australia. So it wasn't something that I could kind of extrapolate out and say, this is happening in, you know, South America, and this is the same terms that people are using in Africa or anything like that. So as far as I've come across, yeah, femme is very Western, but I think that, yeah, in different spaces and cultures, as we see with non-binary, right? Like there's different terms that have existed for hundreds of years, thousands of years, for people that have those experiences of a kind of third gender position or a different articulation beyond binary. So it's not like those experiences of gender and sexuality aren't similar. It's just that the terms and the groups that form around them are very culturally specific.
Wow. And do you feel that there will be another movement in terms of fluidity to even further expand the gender spectrum in terms of presentations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's a really growing understanding and awareness now of non-binary in a way that there wasn't even just a few years ago. And like what that means for people in terms of how collectives form around that is really interesting to think about. I mean, yeah, think about our terminology that we use, like LGBT, how well that captures that or doesn't, how well our major pride parades and pride centers and things do or don't capture that, those experiences. And and what it just means on an everyday basis for people who are starting to identify, not in line with the gender binary designations, what it means for actually rethinking gender more broadly in society. So I don't know. I think it's really interesting. And I think it's really good to see that I think, there's a lot of space for people people are creating to question. It's not about how I look. It's not about how I present myself. It's not about who I sleep with, it's like, and that I think is really exploding the general categories we've had around gender and sexuality.
It's wonderful. And as a teacher, for me, it's wonderful to see younger people coming through now, really using this new way of one's expression of the exterior self to really empower themselves and create a space of uniqueness and really step away from that, original binary notions of female and male, and now being allowed to express their self in many ways without being labelled, as something of the other. It almost becoming almost to be the other now is hopefully inclusiveness. That's just another way of one expressing themselves. Wonderful work that you've created there. And this leads me to your exciting new area that you've started working on, and the role of beauty, and really unpacking that. Tell me what influenced you to kind of pursue this?
So when I finished my PhD and I was trying to think about new directions for my research, I wanted to keep working on femininity and, in this space that's emerged called critical femininity studies, which is trying to kind of focus on and revalue femininity as something to be taken seriously as masculinity studies, which is very, popular and well-funded.
No,
so,
true.
So I wanted to keep working in critical femininity studies, but I wanted to move away from LGBTQ plus identity politics spaces, because I thought, the conclusion that really we should be able to see all femininity as potentially queer, it leads me to a path of wanting to focus on femininity that isn't necessarily coded as queer, if that makes sense. So I turned to the space of the hair and beauty salon because it's seen and perceived as a very highly feminized space, a space where predominantly women are imagined to engage with beauty practices, beauty norms, and also in real terms is staffed by a feminized workforce. So I ended up getting some money from the University of Melbourne, which I started working at after my PhD. And I did a little pilot project about aesthetic labour. So the idea was to interview salon workers about the kind of expectations of their presentation in working in the salon, because I thought, they're styling other people, they're trying to make other people look good, but are they being paid to style themselves in particular ways? Like, is that stressful? Like, what's going on? And as soon as I started talking to salon workers about labor in the salon, they were like, oh yeah, aesthetic labor, they didn't use that term, but they were like, oh yeah, I have to look a certain way. But actually what's more important is the work I have to do making my clients feel good. And I was like, what? Like, I never kind of thought about this. And so naturally, even though I thought I was going to focus on aesthetic labor, it ended up being all about emotional labor. So all about the kind of work that salon workers do to change people's emotions and, have a debriefing session with their clients, hear disclosures from their clients about things going on in their life, some very mundane, some very, very full on and very difficult. And that pilot project, it was really fantastic because I feel like I was very open to hearing from the participants and just being open to what they wanted to tell me was important, and it changed the direction of my research. And then I ended up working with a domestic violence service called the Eastern Domestic Violence Service, who I had found out were running a training program with hairdressers and other salon workers to train them to respond to disclosures of family violence, which really intersected with what I'd just found in my pilot study. So I worked with EDVOS to kind of evaluate their training program in terms of how salon workers actually felt about the training, whether it was an additional burden to kind of be expected to respond to family violence. And actually, I found that they were extremely glad to have some training, because it's something that they encounter quite frequently in their day-to-day work, but don't have any training for at all. There's no training at all on anything related to emotional labour in the salon professional technical skills that you have to get, like to get a certificate and to get qualified. So that ended up being the basis for my DECRA application with the Australian Research Council, which was successful and which I started in July 2020. And that's what I've been working on ever since, is investigating the kind of emotional work involved in salon work and the relationship between clients and workers, how salon workers can be better supported. And there's a kind of technical side, which is like, how can we reform the industry? How can the hair and beauty industry do better? How can we support the hair and beauty industry to do better, to train their workers and support them? But then there's also this theoretical side that says, okay, well, if we're thinking about salons as these spaces of not just the reproduction of beauty norms, but actually about this emotional space that they create, then how do we have to think differently about beauty? What it means to people? What does it mean for people to go to these spaces? What does it mean to account for the labour that's involved in that? And it's a different angle on how we've often thought about beauty. And so it's very much related to my earlier work about femininity and gender presentation. It's just coming from a slightly different angle and focusing a lot more on labour.
Wow, that's so fantastic. I keep saying the word wow because I'm just blown away. I've always been I must admit I'm biased. I've always admired your work, and it has influenced my way of seeing myself, and it has empowered me as a trans woman to really embrace my uniqueness and really accept myself. So I want to thank you for that. And as we're concluding to this, can you tell us a little bit more about your book, Queer Theory, that you co-authored? Tell us, where can we get it? Where can the other listeners get it?
Yeah, so when I'd finished my Queering Femininity book, which was the PhD turned into a book, I started a new project with my colleague Whitney Monaghan, who's at Monash, on this text called Queer Theory Now, From Foundations to Futures. And it's really just a passion project. I mean, it wasn't related to this new beauty salon work that I was doing. It was about, the fact that both Whitney and I are passionate about queer theory and teaching it and translating it in ways that people can feel like they're not alienated by it. And so the book, it's essentially a textbook. It goes through the history of how queer theory emerged from feminist thinking and from queer activism, particularly focusing on AIDS activism, and then focusing on key theorists like Judith Butler and Sedgwick and, all the other cast of characters. It's got a lot of examples and a lot of kind of applied ways of thinking about different terms, a lot of definitions, so on. So it's really intended for someone that hasn't come across queer theory before, but hopefully if you have and you are already really familiar with it, it's a good kind of summary book as well. And, the activism focus is such a huge thing in it because we wanted to show that queer theory has never come from people sitting in a room in the ivory tower thinking about queer in this totally abstract way. It's come from the streets, it's come from organizing, and it's come from below. So my position is, all queer people are queer theorists. They just aren't necessarily in the academy. And sometimes queer theory can be scary because of the language, and it can feel very elite and very specialized, but people just need to remember that they are experts in their own lives and experiences, and that they have something to contribute to queer theory, because essentially it's not what can we get from queer theory, but what can queer theory get from us. So that was the aim of the book, and you can get it from online. If you look up queer theory now, you can get it as an ebook or order the book. You can also get it through some local bookstores. You can order it in. We did have troubles because we launched it right at the beginning of the pandemic, and there was trouble printing it in Australia, but I think that's resolved now. So
I can highly recommend to everyone, get your own copy. It really does change lives, and it really will empower you. If anything, if you are queer or even an ally in understanding the power of our lived experience, it really can help understand and really bridge the community, really understanding diversity. Dr. Hannah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for participating in our Sociology of Media Voices series today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great to chat.